A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't saying nothin'. Just don't send me back. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless. It was a constant presence in Silas's life, a sound that filled the crushing silence of his homestead, a physical force that mirrored the hollowness inside him. It whipped dust into the cracks of his small cabin, stung his skin when he worked the fence line, and howled at night like a grieving animal. He had come to this isolated patch of land years ago, seeking a quiet place to let his guilt fester. He chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. Each swing of the axe was a penance, each splintered log a moment of forgetting. The rhythm of work was his only prayer, his exhaustion the only peace he allowed himself. His days were a deliberate cycle of hard labor and quiet endurance, marked by the rising of a dusty sun and the setting of a slate evening sky. He mended what was broken, tended to what little would grow, and spoke to no one but his horse, and even then only in gruff, single-word commands. His tired eyes, the color of a winter sky, had seen everything and now chose to see nothing. They looked upon the vast, empty landscape and saw a reflection of his own soul. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was waiting for him in the one place he never wanted to go, the town of Redemption Gulch. His supplies were low, the flour sack nearly empty, the salt pork gone. The trip was a necessity he dreaded, a journey back into a world of noise and judgment he had long since abandoned. He saddled his horse, the creak of the leather a familiar complaint in the frosty air, and rode east, his shoulders weary under the weight of more than just the years. Redemption Gulch was a wound on the face of the prairie, a collection of raw lumber buildings and muddy streets where hope came to die. As he rode in, the usual cacophony assaulted him. The clinking of glasses from the saloon, the clang of a hammer on an anvil, the loud, braying laughter of men with nothing better to do. And in the center of it all, a small crowd had gathered. They were arranged in a loose circle around the auction platform outside the general store, a place usually reserved for livestock. But today the product was human. Silas saw her immediately, a woman standing rigid and still, a small boy clinging to the folds of her worn dress. She was Apache, that much was clear from her high cheekbones and the proud, unbroken line of her jaw, but her spirit seemed to be hanging by a thread. She was coatless against the biting wind, her thin dress offering little protection. She did not shiver. Her stillness was a shield, a last bastion of dignity in the face of utter degradation. The man on the platform with her was Barlow, a rancher with a face like curdled milk and a heart to match. He was gesturing to her as if she were a lame horse, his voice booming with false bonhomie. A bit wounded, boys, but strong-backed and quiet. Won't give you no trouble. Good for laundry, mending, whatever you need a pair of hands for. He pointed to a faint scar on her cheek, a pale line against her sun-darkened skin. Got a bit of fight in her, but that's been taken care of, the crowd chuckled. A few men made lewd comments, their words like stones thrown at her silence. She did not flinch, did not even seem to hear them. Her gaze was fixed on some distant point over their heads, a place they could not touch. Her son, his face buried in her leg, was a small, trembling anchor in a sea of cruelty. Silas watched from the edge of the crowd, his face an unreadable mask. The scene churned something cold and old inside him. He saw the woman's exhausted, alert eyes, the way her hand rested protectively on her son's head. A memory flickered, sharp and painful as a shard of glass. His wife, Sarah, standing on their porch, her hand on their son's shoulder, the pale winter sun glinting in her hair. The memory was a ghost, and it brought with it the familiar ache of failure. He had not been there to protect them. He had been away, chasing a fool's dream of more land, more money, and a fever had stolen them while he was gone. He had returned to a silent cabin and a fresh grave on the hill. The same helplessness he felt then rose in him now, a bitter tide. He was just a spectator to another's suffering. He should have turned away. He should have gotten his supplies and ridden back to his fortress of solitude. But he did not. He stayed. The bidding began. A cruel joke played out for the town's amusement. $5! One man shouted, to a round of laughter. Barlow played along, his grin widening. $5 for a sturdy worker and her boy? Come now, gentlemen, be generous. Another man, drunk and swaying, offered a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The laughter grew louder, a wave of scorn that washed over the woman on the platform. She remained still, a statue carved from endurance. Her son, however, began to cry softly, his small sobs muffled against her dress. That sound, the sound of a child's fear, was what broke through Silas's numbness. It was a sound he had not heard in years, a sound he had sworn he would never hear again. It was the sound of his own failure, echoing across the desolate landscape of his memory. He felt the cold rage that had been his companion for so long begin to thaw, replaced by something fierce and protective. He saw the boy's small frame shaking with cold and terror, and in that moment, the boy was not a stranger. He was Tom. He was his son. Silas pushed through the crowd, his movements deliberate and heavy. The townsfolk parted before him, their laughter dying in their throats. They knew this man, the silent rider from the hills, the one who kept to himself, whose eyes held a permanent winter. His arrival was an unexpected disruption to their sport. Barlow's smile faltered for a second as Silas stepped up to the platform. "Well now, Silas, didn't take you for a man in need of help," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. Silas ignored him. His gaze met the woman's for the first time. He saw fear in her eyes, yes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else. A defiant spark, a refusal to be completely extinguished. It was the dignity of the survivor. He did not speak. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, the one that held the gold dust he'd been saving for a new plow and a winter's worth of grain. He poured a heavy measure into his hand, the glittering dust a stark contrast to the grime of the town. He held it out for Barlow to see. The crowd gasped. It was more than a month's wages for most of them. It was a fortune for a woman they considered less than worthless. Barlow's eyes widened with greed. "That's a generous offer," he stammered, his jovial mask slipping to reveal the avarice beneath. Silas didn't wait for an answer. He simply poured the gold into Barlow's outstretched hand, the transaction cold and impersonal. He had not bought a person. He had bought her freedom from this place. He had paid to silence the laughter. He turned to the woman. His face was still a mask of stone, offering no comfort, no explanation. He simply nodded his head once toward his horse, a silent command. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her dark eyes searching his for a clue to her fate. She found nothing, but the alternative was to stay here, to be at the mercy of the laughing crowd. She breathed softly, a small, unsteady puff of air in the cold, and then she nodded back. She picked up her son, whose sobs had quieted to a fearful whimpering, and with as much composure as she could muster, she stepped down from the platform. The crowd was utterly silent now, watching as the strange trio prepared to leave. Silas mounted his horse. The woman, Nita, began to walk behind him, her son held tight against her chest. She did not look back. The journey to the homestead was a long, silent procession. The wind was their only companion, whispering through the dry grass. The ride was an exercise in quiet tension. Nita followed Silas's horse on foot, her pace steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at her limbs. She kept a deliberate distance, a space of about 20 feet separating her from the silent man who now owned her. She did not know what to expect. In her experience, men who paid for women expected payment in return, often of the cruelest kind. She watched his back, the broad, weathered set of his shoulders, looking for any sign of his intent. But he never looked back, never spoke a word. He just rode on, a solitary figure moving through a desolate world. Her son, little Hawk, was a warm, heavy weight in her arms. He had finally fallen asleep, his face tucked into the crook of her neck, his small breaths a comfort against her skin. She walked on worn-down shoes that did little to protect her from the sharp rocks on the trail. Each step was a small act of defiance, a promise to her son that she would endure this, just as she had endured everything else. When they finally arrived at the homestead, the sun was a pale, watery disk sinking toward the horizon. The place was as stark and lonely as the man himself. A small, solid cabin stood against the vast, empty sky, with a sturdy-looking barn and a smaller outbuilding nearby. A curl of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, a lonely signal in the wilderness. Silas dismounted, his movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. He didn't look at her. He simply pointed a finger toward the outbuilding, a former bunkhouse by the looks of it. "There," was the only word he said, his voice rough from disuse. He then walked to the well, drew a bucket of water, and filled a tin cup. He placed it, along with a clean but threadbare blanket, on the single step leading up to the shed's wooden door. Then he turned and walked into his own cabin. The door closed behind him with a quiet, final click. The sound echoed in the immense silence. Nita stood frozen for a long moment, the biting wind whipping strands of her dark hair across her face. This was her new prison. She approached the shed cautiously, as if it might be a trap. Peering inside, she saw it was empty but clean. There was a simple cot in the corner, a small, cold stove, and a single window covered with a piece of oiled parchment that glowed faintly in the dying light. It was cold. It was bare. But it had 4 walls and a door that could be barred from the inside. She carried her son in and laid him gently on the cot, pulling the blanket Silas had left over his small body. She examined the shed more closely. The floorboards were swept clean. There was a small pile of kindling and a few split logs next to the stove. It was a place prepared, however sparsely. She went back outside and drank the water from the tin cup. It was cold and clean, tasting of the deep earth. She looked over at the main cabin. A smoky lamp had been lit inside, casting a warm, yellow square against the growing darkness. She could hear the faint creak of floorboards as he moved about inside. She was a stone's throw away, yet they were worlds apart. She retreated into the shed and barred the door. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her stomach. She sat on the floor beside the cot, her back against the wall, and watched her son sleep. She did not sleep. She listened. She cataloged the sounds of her new life. The howl of a distant coyote, the rustle of some small creature in the brush, and the steady, rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood that started up from behind the main cabin and continued deep into the night. It was the sound of a man at war with himself. She endured. It was what she did best. She created a routine out of the silence and the space he gave her. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, unbar her door, and fetch water from the well. She would see his broad back as he worked, mending a fence or tending to his horse, but he never acknowledged her presence. They moved around each other like 2 planets in a silent, predictable orbit, held together by a gravity they didn't understand. Days bled into a week, the pattern of their lives setting like concrete. Silas rose with the first hint of gray light, his mind already on the endless list of chores that kept the demons at bay. He worked until his muscles burned and his thoughts were blessedly empty. He was aware of her, of course. He saw her from the corner of his eye, a small, resilient figure moving with a quiet dignity that pricked at his conscience. He saw her gathering fallen branches for her fire, her movements unobtrusive and calm. He saw her washing her son's single spare shirt in a bucket of cold water, her hands raw from the lye soap. He saw the way she watched him, her eyes always alert, always measuring him. He ate his meals of salt pork and beans alone in his cabin, the silence of the room a familiar weight. But now the silence was different. It was punctuated by the knowledge of their presence just across the dusty yard. He would hear the boy's soft voice, a sound like a tiny, hesitant bird, and the low murmur of his mother's replies. These small sounds of life were intruders in his temple of grief, and he didn't know what to do with them. He began to notice the details of their hardship. Her shoes were falling apart, the soles worn so thin that the rocky ground must have bruised her feet with every step. The boy's cough, a dry, persistent hack, seemed to worsen in the frosty air of the mornings. These observations were an inconvenience. They demanded something from him, a response he was not prepared to give. To help was to connect, and connection was a door he had nailed shut long ago. Yet he could not ignore it. The memory of his own son, Tom, coughing through the night as the fever took hold, was a wound that would not scar over. One evening, after a long day of clearing rock from a patch of land he had no intention of ever planting, he went into his own small storage room. He found an old pair of Sarah's boots. They were sturdy and well-made, worn but not worn out. He spent an hour by the fire, carefully rubbing grease into the cracked leather to soften it. His hands, usually so rough, moving with a gentle, deliberate care. Before dawn the next morning, while the world was still shrouded in a deep fog, he walked across the yard and placed the boots on the step of her shed. He did not knock. He did not wait. He simply left them there and retreated back into his own solitude. A few days later, he shot a deer. He spent the day butchering the animal, smoking the meat, and packing it for the winter. That evening, he cut off a generous piece of the venison, wrapped it in cloth, and left it on her step, next to a small sack of flour and a tin of salt. He felt like a thief in the night, his acts of kindness committed under the cover of darkness. He did not want thanks. He did not want acknowledgement. He wanted only to quiet the insistent voice in his head that sounded so much like his wife's, whispering that a man has a duty to care for those under his roof. Nita found these offerings with a heart full of suspicion. The boots fit as if they were made for her. The meat and flour were a small fortune, a promise of sustenance through the lean days ahead. But nothing in her life had ever been given freely. Every kindness had come with a price, a debt to be paid later. She examined the gifts, looking for the hidden hook, the invisible string. She thought this silent, wounded man was perhaps just fattening her up for some future cruelty, or that he was creating a debt so large she could never repay it, thus binding her to him forever. Her fear and her hope were at war. The fear was an old, familiar soldier, battle-hardened and cynical. The hope was a new recruit, fragile and easily broken. She started wearing the boots. They were warm and protected her feet. She cooked the venison, and the rich smell of roasting meat filled her small shed, a scent of prosperity she hadn't known in a long time. She fed her son, watching as the food brought a little color back to his pale cheeks. She still kept her distance from Silas, their silent dance continuing, but now a new element had been introduced. A question. Possibility. She did not trust him. Not yet. But she began to watch him with a different kind of attention, not just as a potential threat, but as a puzzle she could not solve. She saw him one afternoon, standing by the small, fenced-off grave on the hill behind the cabin. He just stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, his head bowed against the wind. He looked smaller then, less like a mountain and more like a man being worn down by the weather of his own heart. In that moment, she felt a flicker of something akin to understanding. He was a man made of grief, and grief was a language she knew all too well. The first snows came early that year, a fine, dusting powder that turned to a thick, wet blanket overnight. Then the temperature plummeted, and the world outside the cabin froze solid. A deep, biting wind rose from the north, a relentless force that scoured the landscape and rattled the very bones of the buildings. A blizzard settled over the homestead, burying it in a sea of white. The world shrank to the small patch of land around the cabin, the vastness of the prairie erased by the swirling snow. For 2 days, Silas and Nita were confined to their separate shelters, prisoners of the storm. Silas kept his fire roaring, the warmth of the stove a small comfort against the fury of the wind. He could barely see the shed across the yard through the thick curtain of snow, but he knew it was not built to withstand this kind of cold. The walls were thinner, the insulation non-existent. He imagined the frost creeping up the inside of the walls, the cold seeping through the floorboards. He found himself listening, straining to hear any sound from across the yard over the howl of the wind. And then he heard it, faintly at first, then more clearly during a lull in the storm. The sound of a child coughing, a desperate, racking sound that was being ripped from a small body. The sound was a ghost from his past, the very same sound that had haunted his nightmares for years. It was the cough of his son, Tom, in the final days of his fever. The sound drilled into him, bypassing the layers of numbness he had so carefully constructed. He tried to ignore it. He threw another log on the fire, the crackling flames a poor distraction. He paced the length of his small cabin, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor. But the sound persisted, a phantom echo of his greatest failure. He had been helpless then. He was not helpless now. He endured it for a whole day, the sound a constant torment. By the second night, he could bear it no longer. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and plunged into the blizzard. The wind tore at him, the snow blinding him, but he pushed forward, his focus singular. He reached the door of the shed and, without knocking, pushed it open. The sight inside stopped him cold. A wave of frigid air met him. The small stove had gone out, the pile of wood beside it exhausted. Nita was crouched on the floor, her own thin blanket wrapped around her and her son. She was holding him tight, trying to warm him with her own body heat, but it was a losing battle. The boy was shivering violently, his face pale and his lips tinged with blue. Nita looked up as Silas entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight to the death to protect her young. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the only sound the howling of the wind and the boy's ragged breathing. Silas saw the raw terror in her face, and it mirrored the terror he had once felt, the terror of a parent watching their child slip away. In that moment, she was not the Apache woman he had bought, and he was not the silent man who owned her. They were just two people, bound by a shared, unspeakable grief. He broke the silence, his first real words to her more of a command than a request, but his voice was thick with an emotion he could not name. "Bring him inside." She flinched at the sound of his voice, her body tensing. She expected a blow, an order to do something terrible. But then she looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw past the cold, stony exterior. She saw the deep, aching pain that lived there. It was a pain she recognized. It was the same pain that lived in her own heart. There was no cruelty in his eyes, no lust, only a shared history of loss. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Carefully, she gathered her son into her arms, bundling him as tightly as she could in the blanket. She rose to her feet, her legs unsteady from the cold and fear. Silas held the door open for her against the wind, shielding her with his own body as she stepped out into the storm. She followed him across the yard, her head bowed against the stinging snow, her son a precious, fragile burden in her arms. The short journey felt like a mile, but then they were inside his cabin, and the warmth hit them like a physical blow. It was a simple, masculine space, clean and orderly, but filled with the profound warmth of a well-tended fire. He had brought them into his home. Something had changed. The wall of silence had been breached. The blizzard raged for another day and a night, locking them inside the small cabin together. An uneasy truce settled between them. Nita and Little Hawk occupied the space near the hearth, while Silas kept to the other side of the room, creating an invisible line of demarcation. He busied himself with small tasks, mending a piece of tack, sharpening his knives, his hands always needing to be occupied. But he was acutely aware of them, of her quiet presence and the boy's shallow, fevered breaths. He brewed a strong, bitter tea from herbs he kept for just such an occasion and, without a word, set a steaming tin cup beside her. She looked at him, then at the tea, and after a moment's hesitation, she coaxed a few sips into her son. The boy's fever raged through the night. Nita did not sleep, bathing his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. Silas did not sleep either. He sat in his chair in the shadows, watching over them, the rhythmic creak of the floorboards under his boots the only sound he made. He was a silent, brooding guardian, his presence both intimidating and strangely comforting. As the storm passed and the world outside grew quiet and bright with new fallen snow, the boy's fever broke. color returned to his cheeks, and his breathing eased. A fragile peace descended upon the cabin. They were now sharing a roof, a fire, a life. The unspoken rules of their arrangement had been rewritten. When the supplies ran low again a few weeks later, there was no question of leaving them behind. The journey back to Redemption Gulch was different this time. Nita and Little Hawk rode on the horse with Silas, the boy bundled in blankets between them, Nita's hands resting lightly on Silas's waist to steady herself. It was the first time they had touched. The physical contact was a jolt to his system, a warmth that spread through his back, unfamiliar and unsettling. The town was just as ugly as he remembered it. As they rode down the main street, windows and doorways filled with curious, whispering faces. Their strange domestic arrangement was the subject of much speculation. And then he saw Barlow, standing on the porch of the saloon, a sneer already forming on his fleshy face. Barlow saw them too, and his eyes narrowed with a possessive fury. In his mind, Nita was still his property, merely on loan to the silent man from the hills. He strode into the street, blocking their path. "Well, well," Barlow boomed, his voice laced with malice. "Look what we have here. Playing house, are we, Silas? Getting good use out of your investment." Silas reined in the horse, his body going rigid. Nita flinched, pulling Little Hawk closer to her. "She looks a damn sight better than when I sold her to you," Barlow continued, circling the horse, his eyes raking over Nita with a look of vile ownership. "Must be feeding her well. Though I can't imagine what you'd want with damaged goods like that." The townsfolk who had gathered to watch snickered. The laughter was a fresh assault, reopening a wound Nita thought had begun to scar over. She lowered her gaze, her face burning with shame, her body a column of rigid endurance. She tried to make herself small, to disappear. Little Hawk, sensing his mother's distress, began to whimper. Silas dismounted slowly. He placed himself between Barlow and the horse, a solid, unmovable wall. He said nothing. He simply stood there, his presence radiating a cold, lethal calm. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "What's the matter, Silas?" Barlow taunted, emboldened by the audience. "Cat got your tongue? You paid a fortune for her. Don't you have anything to say about your purchase?" Silas looked at Barlow then, and his eyes were like chips of ice. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried across the silent street with the force of a hammer blow. "She's with me," Barlow laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I know she's with you. You bought her." Right here in the street, Silas took a half step forward. "Not bought," he said, the words clear and deliberate. "Chosen." The word hung in the frosty air. Chosen. It was a declaration. It was a correction. It was a shield. It reframed the entire sordid transaction, transforming it from an act of commerce into an act of will. The crowd fell silent, the smirks wiped from their faces. Barlow, for all his bluster, recognized the deadly seriousness in Silas's tone. He saw the truth of the statement in the man's unwavering gaze. He had been challenged and defeated, not by fists, but by a single powerful word. He sputtered for a moment. Then, seeing no support from the now subdued crowd, he backed away, melting back into the saloon's shadows. Silas stood there for a long moment, a guardian, until the street was clear. Then he turned back to the horse. Nita looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. He had defended her. He had given her back her name, her personhood, in front of the very people who had tried to strip it from her. He simply nodded once, then lifted Little Hawk from her arms and swung back into the saddle. He had shut them all up. The ride back to the homestead was imbued with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of fear or uncertainty that had marked their first journey. This was a silence of shared experience, a quiet space filled with unspoken understanding. Nita sat behind Silas, her hands once again on his waist, but this time they were not just for balance. They were a connection. She could feel the steady strength in his back, the slow, rhythmic beat of his heart. She felt safe. For the first time in a very long time, she felt truly safe. They worked together to unload the supplies, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. That evening, after Little Hawk was asleep in the small cot, Silas had moved into a corner of the main cabin. They sat on the porch. The air was cold and crisp, the sky a vast blanket of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The wind was gentle for once, a soft whisper in the dry grass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat watching the stars, comfortable in the quiet. It was Nita who broke the silence. Her voice was soft, hesitant at first, like a stream finding its way over new stones. In broken, careful English, she began to speak. She told him her name. She told him of her village, a place of green valleys and clear water, a place that now existed only in her memory. She spoke of her husband, a strong hunter named Black Wolf, who had been killed by soldiers. She told him about the raid, the fire, the screaming, and the long, brutal march that had eventually led her to the auction block in Redemption Gulch. She did not cry. Her words were delivered with a quiet, factual dignity, a testament to what she had endured. Her suffering was a part of her, but it did not define her. Silas listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just sat beside her, his presence a solid anchor in the dark, and gave her the rare gift of his full attention. He nodded from time to time, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, but she knew he heard every word. When she finished, a profound quiet settled over them once more. The story hung in the air between them, a fragile, sacred thing. Then Silas cleared his throat. His own voice, when it came, was rough and low, the sound of a man unaccustomed to sharing his pain. "There's a grave," he said, his voice barely more than a murmur. "On the hill." Behind the cabin, Nita nodded. She had seen it. "My wife, Sarah," he continued, the name a stone in his mouth. "And our boy, Tom." He told her how they had died. A fever that had swept through the territory. He had been away, chasing a deal on a neighboring parcel of land, convinced that more was what they needed. More land, more security. He had been gone a week too long. When he returned, he found his neighbor had already buried them. "I wasn't here," he said, the 3 words containing a universe of guilt. "I should have been here." He fell silent, the confession leaving him empty and exposed. The wind seemed to carry his raw, suppressed grief out into the vast darkness. After a moment, Nita moved. Her hand, small and weathered from work, reached across the space between them and gently touched his forearm. It was not a gesture of pity, but of solidarity. A simple, profound acknowledgement of his pain. Her touch was light, but it grounded him. It was the first gentle human contact he had felt in years. It was an offering of forgiveness, not just for his past, but for his silence. In that shared moment of confession, under the silent witness of the stars, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They were no longer a silent man and the woman he had bought. They were Silas and Nita, 2 survivors, 2 lonely souls who had found in each other a quiet harbor from the storms of their past. They were no longer alone. They had found the beginning of home. Winter finally relinquished its icy grip, its retreat slow and grudging at first, then all at once. The deep snow melted, feeding the thirsty earth, and the world turned from white and gray to the tender green of new life. The biting wind softened into a gentle breeze, and the dusty sun grew warmer, more generous. As the land thawed, so did the inhabitants of the small homestead. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude for Silas, slowly transformed into a home. The transformation was not marked by grand declarations, but by 1,000 small, quiet changes. Nita planted a garden in the patch of earth Silas had cleared of rocks. She used seeds she had carefully saved, carried with her through all her trials in a small leather pouch. Soon, tender shoots of corn, squash, and beans pushed their way through the dark soil. The sight of this new life growing was a daily miracle, a promise of a future. Little Hawk, who had been a quiet, watchful shadow, began to thaw as well. The warmth of the sun and the security of his new life coaxed him out of his shell. He started to explore the homestead, his small legs carrying him on adventures to the creek and back. One afternoon, Silas heard a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound that struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the sound of a child's laughter, clear and bright as a birdsong. Little Hawk was chasing a butterfly, his face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. The sound filled the empty spaces in Silas's heart, chasing out the ghosts that had resided there for so long. They fell into a new rhythm, one of partnership. They worked together, their tasks divided by an unspoken agreement. He would work the fence line, and she would bring him a tin cup of cool water. She would tend her garden, and he would mend the handle of her hoe. They mended the roof of the cabin together, their hands often brushing, their movements a quiet, efficient dance of reliability and mutual trust. There were no wasted words, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, of shared purpose. In the evenings, after the work was done, Silas began a new project. He brought out a beautiful piece of oak he had been saving for years, a piece he had once intended to use to build a cradle for his next child. The wood was smooth and flawless. With his sharpest knife, he began to carve. First, he made a small, simple wooden horse for Little Hawk. He sanded it until it was smooth as glass and rubbed it with oil until the grain shone. The boy's eyes lit up when Silas presented it to him, and he clutched the toy as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Then Silas began to work on a larger project. Night after night, by the smoky light of the lamp, he carved and shaped the oak. Nita would sit nearby, mending clothes or shelling beans, the soft scrape of his tools a peaceful, domestic sound. She watched as, under his calloused, capable hands, a rocking chair began to take shape. It was a beautiful thing, simple and sturdy, its lines clean and honest, much like the man making it. The narrator, watching from a place beyond time, could see what Silas himself was only just beginning to feel. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out, but this woman and her child had slipped past his defenses without him even noticing. They had not torn the walls down. They had simply made a home inside them. From the dust and silence of his grief, a family was quietly, improbably, growing. He didn't know it yet, but this was his redemption. It wasn't in a grand act of heroism, but in the daily choice to care, to protect, to build. His first true home was right in front of him. The story of a family is not always written in grand, sweeping chapters. Sometimes, it is written in the quiet margins of daily life, in gestures so small they are almost invisible. Love is not always a bolt of lightning or a raging fire. Sometimes, it is the slow, steady warmth of a hearth on a cold night. It grows in the silence, where no one is looking, nurtured by cups of warm broth and shared blankets, by a steady presence in the dark. It is built not on passionate declarations, but on the solid foundation of reliability. It is the unspoken promise in the wood chopped and stacked for winter, in the garden weeded and watered, in the roof patched against the rain. This was the love that grew on that lonely homestead, a hardy, resilient thing, accustomed to harsh weather and rocky soil. For Silas, it was the rediscovery of a purpose beyond mere survival. Each nail he hammered, each furrow he plowed, was an act of devotion. He was no longer just enduring his existence. He was building a life, a sanctuary for the woman and child who had stumbled into his solitude. He was protecting not just their bodies, but their right to have a peaceful place in the world. He found that in caring for them, he was slowly, painstakingly healing himself. The deep, raw wound of his past began to scar over, not disappearing, but becoming a part of him he could live with, a source of empathy rather than a well of despair. For Nita, it was the slow unfurling of a spirit that had been forced to curl in on itself for protection. In the safety of Silas's quiet strength, she found the freedom to be more than just a survivor. She was a mother, a gardener, a partner. She brought a gentle touch to the harsh angles of his life, her quiet humming as she worked a soft counterpoint to the ever-present wind. She remembered old songs from her village and taught them to Little Hawk, her voice a thread connecting their new life to the one that had been stolen. Her dignity, which had been her shield and her armor in the face of cruelty, was now able to blossom into a quiet, confident grace. It was something that could never be bought or sold, a light that she had carried inside her all along. Silas had not given it to her. He had simply provided a place where she felt safe enough to let it shine. The people in Redemption Gulch still whispered, of course. They would see Silas in town buying not just flour and salt, but a length of soft calico cloth or a small bag of candy for the boy. They would shake their heads at the silent rider and the strange family he was building with the wounded Apache woman he'd overpaid for. They saw a fool who had thrown his money away. They could not comprehend what he had truly purchased. He had not bought a servant. He had bought a future. He had paid the price to shut up the mocking world and, in doing so, had opened the door to his own salvation. On the homestead, their whispers could not reach. There was only the sound of the wind in the tall grass, the happy shouts of a little boy playing with a wooden horse, and the peaceful, rhythmic creak of two people finding their way back to life together. They were building a home from the broken pieces of their pasts, proving that the most beautiful things can grow in the most unlikely of places. From dust and silence, a family. From closed hearts, a home. The rocking chair was finished. It stood by the hearth, its oaken arms worn smooth and warm to the touch. Silas had sanded every surface until it felt like silk, the wood glowing with a deep, rich luster in the firelight. It was a masterpiece of simple, honest craftsmanship, built to last a lifetime. It was a silent testament, a physical manifestation of all the words he could not say. He did not present it with a flourish. He did not say, "This is for you." He simply moved it into its rightful place one evening and left it there, an offering. That night, after their simple meal, Nita looked at the chair for a long moment. She ran her hand over its curved back, feeling the care that had gone into its making. Then, she lifted a sleeping little hawk into her arms, settled into the chair, and began to rock. The chair moved with a smooth, gentle, rhythmic creak, a sound that was instantly, deeply peaceful. It was the sound of contentment. It was the sound of home. Silas stood by the mantel, watching them, his heart full of a quiet, powerful emotion he couldn't have named. The smoky lamplight cast a warm glow over the scene, framing Nita and her son in a portrait of maternal tenderness. He saw her not as the broken woman from the auction block, but as the strong, resilient heart of his home. He saw the boy, not as a stranger's child, but as his son, a bright spark of life and hope. The window was open, letting in the cool night air and the scent of damp earth and pine. It was a symbol of the future, a sign that the walls were gone for good, that the world was being invited in again. He walked over to her. The rocking slowed to a stop as she looked up at him. He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and steady. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark, calm depths, he saw his own reflection, a man no longer lost in the wilderness of his grief. He finally said the words that had been building in his heart for months. They were simple words, but they held the weight of a lifetime of promises. Stay here. It was not a command. It was not an order from a man who had bought her. It was a plea. It was an invitation. It was a question. It was everything. Nita's gaze held his, and a small, gentle smile touched her lips. She leaned her head back slightly, a silent affirmation against his hand. She reached up and placed her own hand over his, her touch warm and certain. She stayed. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Their story is a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of simple, honest kindness. It teaches us that worth is not determined by the laughter of a crowd, but by the steadfast courage of a single heart. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that even in the most desolate of places, and from the deepest of sorrows, love can grow. It reminds us that sometimes the most profound connections are built not with words, but with silent acts of protection, shared work, and the quiet dignity of choosing each other. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the moment he named his price, the quiet defiance in his word chosen, or the simple touch of a hand on a porch in the starlight? We'll see you again, where silence means home.